live at 8 p.m. tonight. Next, a look at the personal life of President John F. Kennedy from investigative reporter Seymour Hersh. He talks about his recent book, The Dark Side of Camelot, and takes audience questions. It's about an hour and 10 minutes.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Carla Cohen. I'm one of the owners of Politics and Prose, and I want to welcome you here tonight to hear my good friend Seymour Hersh. Cy has been a great supporter of Politics and Prose over the years, and it's always a pleasure when a book of his comes out. There's a fair amount of publicity often, and people are interested. And we can say that that's true this time as well. There's my partner, Barbara Mead, standing in the back. And so on behalf of both of us, I want to thank Cy for for everything he's done for us over the years, and to say how glad I am that he's here tonight with us.
Thank you. You know, if Carl asked me to come, I come. And I come, period. I don't worry about it. I'm just here, happy to be here. Great bookstore. I thought I'd just start by giving you a little bedtime reading, literally from a memoir called Johnny, We Hardly Know You, written by Kenny O'Donnell and David Powers, published in 1976, great bestseller. It was described as a warm, intimate portrait of JFK by the men who knew him best. And here's my favorite section. He's describing Dave Powers, who was the president's closest friend, is describing a typical quiet meeting at home with the president. And it says, I'll read you a graph or so. Dave was accustomed to being summoned for night duty at the White House when Jackie was absent. He called himself John's other wife. The president hated to be alone in the evening. It was understood that Dave would be available to keep him company, etc., etc. Dave stayed with him till he went to bed. The nightly routine was always the same. The White House kitchen staff would prepare dinner, broiled chicken or lamb chops, left in a second-floor apartment. It was called the mansion by the Secret Service, the main upstairs living quarter. Literally, apartment's a good word for it. A nice apartment. On a hot plate appliance so they could eat it late in the evening without keeping any of the staff waiting to serve them. Then they would watch television or sit outside on the Truman balcony, or the president would read a book or smoke a cigar while Dave drank several bottles of Heineken's beer. They'd joke a little bit. Around 11 o'clock, the president would get undressed, slipped into the short-length Brooks Brothers sleeping jacket that he wore in preference to pajamas. Dave would watch him kneel beside his bed and say his prayers. Then he would get in the bed and say to David, I'm not kidding. Then he would get in bed and say to David, good night, pal, will you please put out the light? Dave would put out the light, leave the apartment, say good night to the Secret Service agent on duty in the downstairs hall, and drive home to his own home in McLean. Sort of like, I guess you could call it the Norman Rockwell version of life in the White House. But it is a history that was totally a huge bestseller, totally accepted. And so it's something you have to deal with. You know, something I'm dealing with all the time, because this perception, this sort of, he just didn't have to do it. This is a book that has another interesting facet to it. It's not terribly long, but it's pretty long. It's, what, 400 some odd pages in paperback, 500 pages in paperback, and it's about the presidency, mostly. And in the index, there's only one Hoover, and it's Herbert Hoover. There's no J. Edgar Hoover in the index. The only other book I know like that is a book called Kennedy by Theodore Sorensen, which is 800 pages long, which also has only Herbert Hoover in the index. I don't know what to make of that, but let me read you another document. Just another sort of thing when I'm beginning to look at this book, thing I'm thinking about. I'm reading these books. This is not a book. This is a document written by Arthur Schlesinger, the historian, whose books on Jackson and FDR, he did a 3-volume series I remember reading with great passion a long time ago when I was a kid, after I was out of school, when, of course, everybody starts reading. And April the 10th, 61. It's 6 days before the Bay of Pigs invasion. It's a memo to the president. The political, diplomatic, and economic problems we're facing. Some of you might remember your history. Bay of Pigs was the great defeat for the Kennedy administration. And he's giving some advice on how the Russians will exploit the situation. And this is how he's talking to his president. He said the first communist effort will be to nail down the already existing impression that such a landing is sponsored. The landing of Cuban exiles on Cuba at the Bay of Pigs is sponsored to combat the existing impression that such a landing is sponsored by the U.S. No matter how ostensibly Cuban the operation is in fact is in personnel and equipment, most of the world, our friends as well as foes, will assume that it is American in its conception. He's talking to a president, and they both know of something, of course, which is that it's totally American in its conception. The CIA is operating it, doing it. It's not that the Cubans don't want to go, but it wouldn't happen without our involvement. So he's talking in sort of, I don't know, I don't know how to describe that language. But he goes on, and he's talking about how the Russians might exploit it. And he goes on to say, it's a long memo, 10 pages. He said maybe we should do a diversionary measure that might offset Soviet propaganda after the operation. Can we not affirm in some striking way our support for progressive governments in Latin America, like Venezuela? Can we not do something in Africa or Asia that will counteract the Soviet claim that we are unregenerate imperialists? Could something be brought before the United Nations in the next 10 days which permit us to take a strong anti-imperialist position as we go on invading the country? Then he says the following, point 10, protection of the president. The character and repute of President Kennedy constitute one of our greatest national resources. Nothing should be done to jeopardize this invaluable asset. When lies must be told, they should be told by subordinate officials. The next sentence is underlined. At no point should the president be asked to lend himself to the cover operation, that is the flimsy cover that is an indigenous Cuban operation without any outside help. For this reason, writes Schlesinger, there seems to be merit in Secretary Rust's suggestion that someone other than the president make the final decision and do so in his absence. That is the final decision to invade, and do so in his absence, someone whose head can later be placed in the block if things go terribly wrong. Well, you rarely hear it so cleanly. And you rarely do hear it so cleanly, you know, even in a document that wasn't declassified for 25 years. Not only do we lie, but, boss, don't get near signing anything or executing anything. It's called plausible denial. So I know about this document when I start. I read the Johnny, We Hardly Knew You, and I'll just tell you briefly the genesis of this book, which is so mundane as to be sort of staggering. I have an editor. His name is Jim Silberman. He used to be publisher of Random House. He's now at Little Brown. He's the one who encouraged me, more than 20 years ago, to start working on Kissinger. And about 10 years ago, he began whispering, Kennedy, Kennedy, Kennedy. He's a wonderful man. I'm always proud of the fact that he edited Philip Roth, who to me is like manna. Anyway, and so I, of course, resisted, I'm sure in part because it was his idea. And eventually I started reading, got into it, and sort of the heuristic approach, if that's the right word, probably isn't. The idea was, let's not worry about how he died, that is the assassination. Let's look at how he lived and see what that might tell us about how he would die. And I had something going in. I was a reporter at the New York Times, and in fact, many of you might remember, did a lot of work on the CIA and wrote a lot of the stories that, more or less, I'm not overdoing it or underdoing it, but led to the setting up of the Church hearing, the Senate Intelligence Committee. It was provoked by a series of articles I wrote in the Times, New York Times. And so I knew that hearing very well, and I watched it. I moved away from Washington, so I was watching it, just reading it. And what we had was this. We had the Senate Intelligence Committee doing a good job uncovering this awful business of assassinating Castro and other assassinations, Trujillo. In the DR, there was some material in Diem in Vietnam. And we had them saying, well, what's this about? And they summoned CIA officials, the senior CIA officials of the government, Richard Helms, the then CIA director, and other senior officials, Bissell, the man who was the operations director, Dick Bissell of the, call him Dickie Boy, of the CIA. And they summon him and they get him before the committees and they shuffle around and they say, well, and the senators say, you know, trumpeting, I guess, maybe like Fred Thompson, I don't know, trumping away. And, well, who authorized it? Well, we thought we had authorization. They muddle and groan. Well, of course, the senators, as I later learned in doing this book and talking to them, all understood that the president authorized them, but that the CIA is out of business. If the head of the CIA, Richard Helms, says to the Senate committee, Daddy sent me, the CIA, the president told me to do it, they're out of business. And I've got to tell you something. It makes me creep when I think about it. It's a heinous agency. This is an agency that can conduct any heinous operation on behalf of the President of the United States with what they call plausible deniability. Arthur Schlesinger was describing it. We must lie. You have somebody else has to sign it. You can't be near anything heinous. And so the CIA can be instructed by the President to kill a foreign leader. And the President can rest assured that in case, God forbid, nobody could foresee this in 1961, 62, 63, nobody could foresee hearings in which the Senate committee would be asking a senior CIA official, who told you to go and how did you do it? And there's something so odious in this, above and beyond what I'm writing about, what this book is. There's something per se odious in an institution that exists to serve the executive solely, and with total, complete deniability for the executive in case anything goes wrong. There's something really profoundly wrong, but we haven't even gotten to that issue yet. I mean, in talking about this book, because it's still, we're still not there yet in thinking about it. In any case, so I knew when I finally decided to do this book, I knew that I could cash in that story. I knew that I could get retired people in the CIA to say, look, of course we took the fall. What else are we going to do? But of course they sent us, my God. I didn't know how much I could get. I eventually was led, one of the senators, who's now out of the Senate, sent me literally a FedEx care package full of documents that had been seen by the committee and that never made day of light, that really moved it much closer into the Oval Office. I'll tell you right now, the committee also saw the two ranking senators, Hershs was one of them, saw the famous Hoover file, official and confidential file on Jack Kennedy, the one that's never been seen the light of day. I know that file was given to them in '76. It existed, it's gone, we can't find it, I don't know where it is. Probably shredded by the senators. After all, they were Democrats, it was a Democratic year, '76. I can't imagine what happened. In any case, what emerged from the hearings was a muddled finding by the Senate Intelligence Committee that no executive official was responsible. They couldn't fix it, and there were a lot of talk publicly about rogue elephants. Yes, I'm sure the CIA is a rogue elephant on the fringes, but when it comes to being told to kill a foreign leader, particularly an operation they didn't really approve of eventually they got very tired of trying to kill Castro. They tried 8 times, without doing it. In any case, so I just pose all that as some stuff I knew I would cash in. And what happened next is I'm learning a lot about the CIA, and I'm learning a lot. I'm learning a lot about ZM. I'm learning a lot about Trujillo. I'll vouchsafe to you that we don't know nearly as much of all this stuff as we do. And we certainly don't. And I'm learning a lot about and that never made day of light. That really moved it much closer into the Oval Office. I'll tell you right now, the committee also saw the two ranking senators, Hershs was one of them, saw the famous Hoover file, official and confidential file on Jack Kennedy, the one that's never been seen the light of day. I know that file was given to them in '76. It existed, it's gone, we can't find it, I don't know where it is. Probably shredded by the senators. After all, they were Democrats, it was a Democratic year, '76. I can't imagine what happened. In any case, what emerged from the hearings was a muddled finding by the Senate Intelligence Committee that no executive official was responsible. They couldn't fix it, and there were a lot of talk publicly about rogue elephants. Yes, I'm sure the CIA is a rogue elephant on the fringes, but when it comes to being told to kill a foreign leader, particularly an operation they didn't really approve of eventually they got very tired of trying to kill Castro. They tried 8 times, without doing it. In any case, so I just pose all that as some stuff I knew I would cash in. And what happened next is I'm learning a lot about the CIA, and I'm learning a lot about ZM. I'm learning a lot about Trujillo. I'll vouchsafe to you that we don't know nearly as much of all this stuff as we do. And we certainly don't. And I'm learning a lot about Castro and the presidential obsession with Castro. I'm also really being troubled by, there's no question that before he took the White House, Jack Kennedy authorized something called executive action, a capability, only a capability, but he asked senior people of the CIA to set up a capability to execute foreign leaders. It was a Kennedy operation sought by the president before he got into office. I don't have a videotape, but I make an argument for it. I'm willing to take the brickbats for it. There's no question he wanted this to happen. I do have some notes and diaries that haven't been published that suggest that very strongly, do more than suggest it, just about say it. And I've done interviews with people. And of course, anyway, to go on. While doing this work, and being a little, looking at the missile crisis again in a different light, in light of what we were doing to Castro, in terms of, the missile crisis has always been explained by Khrushchev's irrationality. Nikita Khrushchev put the missiles into Cuba as an act of defiance to try and rectify the strategic imbalance, which, by the way, was 3,000 warheads for us, 250 for him. There's no way he's going to rectify a strategic imbalance by a few missiles in Cuba, as a lot of us knew, but anyway. And it's different to see, it's fun, it's sort of interesting to see a different picture, one in which Khrushchev is not quite as irrational, not quite the tin horn dictator that we thought at the time, but maybe moving largely, not solely, but largely to protect an ally he saw as coming under an imminent attack from us, that is Castro. Okay, so it's a different history. And at one point I asked a guy, one of the CIA guys, I said, I was sort of, what I was seeing was recklessness. I mean, recklessness. They were telling me about opposition at the top of the CIA to killing Castro, and I was getting documents that they were showing me, documents that were written in real time expressing that opposition. A little more muted than they were saying it, but clearly saying, what's the strategic purpose of this? And as much as you could say to the president, and they were being told time and time again, it's like, if some of you saw that TV show, Sandy Smith, the Chicago reporter, said about Sam Giancana, when he had a problem, he said, kill him, kill him, kill him. Well, my president was saying, kill him, kill him, kill him, about Fidel Castro, totally off the top. And so when I asked somebody about the recklessness, that's when a CIA guy said to me, he said, Hershs, you want to understand John F. Kennedy, find his agents, Secret Service agents. They'll tell you what you need to know. And many of you have been in government, many of you know, again, the notion that 4 agents, 3 of whom spent their careers in the Secret Service, not only would see me, not only would talk to me, but would go on television, says an awful lot about the enormous, I think, disaffection, maybe even stronger words than that they had for the president they were going to take a bullet for. They both had an admiration and a lot of contempt for him, too. And so that's what put me into the next. Then I knew I was in deep trouble once they started talking to me and were willing to go on the record. I'll tell you one story about one of them. 2 of the 4 were really very smart guys and had read a lot. And both said to me, both of them said, and I talked to them an awful lot. This is beginning in early '95, 3 years ago almost. They said they read Johnny, We Hardly Knew You. They read Sorensen. They read Schlesinger. And they kept on saying to themselves, okay, if that's the history the American people want, that's the way it goes. And one of them, Tony Sherman, a very interesting guy, first generation to go to college, very happy, retired as a special agent in charge of the Salt Lake City office for the Secret Service. You know, these are guys, federal cops who chase counterfeiters, very dedicated, a small sort of elite group. And the elite assignment inside the Secret Service is 2 years protecting the president. Then you go back into the field. And a lot of these guys, one of them, Larry Newman, worked undercover. I can't even tell you now some of the stuff he did. He's asked me not to. Some worked undercover in some amazing stuff where his life was on the line constantly inside criminal operations. So they are interesting. So Sherman told me the following story, just as an example of where they were. He was a reader, and he was caught up in the Peloponnesian War, a great reader of Carthaginian, if there's such a word, history. He was just caught up in that war. And one day, he said in '62, they were on a trip to NATO, and the president had some business meeting, and there was a chopper taking off. They were going someplace from the airport near Rome or someplace in Rome. I don't know exactly where. I don't remember. And at the last minute, Tony's job was to jump into the doorway of the chopper, a heavy AR-15 automatic machine gun at his side, in his lap, and he jumped on and he sat in the open doorway as the chopper took off, and it circled up above Rome and began to head into the hills. And McNamara was aboard, the Secretary of Defense, and McGeorge Bundy, and the president. And there were 4 little seats there, and the president, as is his wont, a terribly nice man, saw Tony sitting there in the doorway. You know, it was rather dangerous. He wasn't belted. He was in a chopper flying, moving around. He said, Tony, get out of there and come sit with us. And so Tony, there was in the chopper was a senior official, a senior inspector, a boss for the Secret Service. He looked at the boss, And that's the way the chain of command to the boss said, okay. So he went and he buckled in next to George Bundy, sitting across from the president of McNamara. And Bundy was given a seminar on the Hannibal crossing the Alps, and he had it wrong. And so Tony's thinking about, what do I do? He's got it all wrong. He's really screwed it up, and this is the president. So he said, if I may, Mr. President, actually it was there, and then they all quickly, I must say to Kennedy's credit, he said, well, tell us more. And he said, I spent 30 minutes telling the president what I knew. And he said, you know, it's an amazing thing. So you have to understand that's one side of it. To come down to the other side where he goes on, willing to go on television and saying what he did was wrong and unpresidential, I'll just lay it out here. It's a lot worse than I even want to tell you. It's bad. It's really bad. It's bad as I write it. It's even worse. And I'm not trying to kid you around. It's just a mess. And so there we are. We have this reckless man privately. We have a man who did what he did. And I am sitting there knowing I'm in a firestorm. And I did it the same way I do everything else. I do want your questions because I know there's been a lot of controversy about it, to put it mildly. I don't like it. But I anticipated it. In fact, it was because of that I went to ABC 2 years ago. I knew that simple words enough. I just knew words wouldn't do it. I thought maybe the pictures would help. And maybe it will. I don't know. It's sort of early. But the thought was, getting it on television was quite a feat too. And sometime, you know, in another life, I'll tell you about that. It's not that easy. It's tough. It's very tough in-your-face television. And so I claim this. I say there was a wonderful side to John F. Kennedy. Yes, he went to the moon. Yes, he had vigor. Yes, he was a leader. Yes, he has made people aspire to serve in government. He made government service seem wonderful. And he made the bureaucracy wonderful, and which I think by and large it is. And he was bright, and he was witty, and he was self-deprecating, and he was very, very pretty and beautiful. And he was somebody who inspired us. But my thesis simply is that the dark side is much more dark than we thought, and maybe even more important ultimately than the light. And in the end, he had to get rid of the man in South Vietnam, Mr. Diem, the president of South Vietnam. In the end, I'm not sure John F. Kennedy believed in the war any more than Robert McNamara, who wrote that amazing book in retrospect in which he acknowledged he did not think we could win the war, and yet sent boy after boy to die, and Vietnamese to die too. John F. Kennedy gave us the first use, I have to say this, of napalm against civilian targets in Vietnam. He gave us the first use of defoliants against food crops in Vietnam. He was the first president to authorize massive relocation of civilians out of their farms into what they called fortified and strategic hamlets, basically holding pens for human beings, many of whom would immediately leave. They weren't protected in these large concrete fortresses surrounded by barbed wire and controlled by the South Vietnamese government at day and the Viet Cong at night. We declared the areas that they had left free fire zones eventually, and would bomb and kill anybody that moved in them. And of course many of the peasants went back there. He gave us that. He also had a vice president he couldn't stand. I think Very was eager to get rid of him. And out of this came one moral that I have, one motto for presidents. I have some working advice for American presidents, which is very simple. Don't die in office without telling your vice president what the hell you're thinking about doing, what your policies are, because it can lead to a lot of trouble. So I have this dark view I'd love to talk to you about. You know, we can go forever. I've talked 22 minutes, 23 minutes, longer than I said. Let's go. Let's do questions. Please, sir. I have to repeat them under the rules of C-SPAN. Yeah.
Well, starting with Powers and Schlesinger, I thought was an interesting device. And if nothing had been written since then, it would give you a great scope for what you've written. But it seems to me that while there was a lot of mythology in the early years, in recent years, an awful lot of the ground that you covered was covered for just one book, Nigel Hamilton's.
Nigel Hamilton, yes.
Nigel Hamilton, 1,000 pages on his reckless...
Reckless Youth. It's a brilliant, wonderful book.
Yeah. But so I'd like you to tell us what you really have to add after books like that.
Well, first of all, I should say that Nigel Hamilton's book, which... Yes, oh, let me repeat the question. Yes, absolutely. The question is that what's new? You know, so what's new in this? Nigel Hamilton wrote a book in which he said a lot. In fact, Nigel Hamilton's book ends in 1946, which is a very important point to remember. He was going to do volume 2. And the abuse after Volume 1 was so great, he went back to London. And I became obviously very friendly with him. He's an unbelievably brilliant man. I don't know if anybody's read his. He did a biography of Field Marshal Montgomery, and he's way out there. He's going to do Nehru. Now he's running an institute for biography. He's going to do a multimedia biography institute in London. A bunch of universities are funding him, and the government, I think, to some degree. But I must say, about a week after my book came out, I called up Nigel and I said, "Okay, buddy, I finally understand why you didn't do Volume 2. Who needs this grief?" So the answer is that Nigel Hamilton, I think, did more to explain John F. Kennedy, and I'm sure, I remember vividly going out of my way to make sure that I don't suggest that I'm writing anything new when it comes to trying to dope him out. I don't spend much time in his early years. I just try and get some rough idea. Try and be sympathetic to John F. Kennedy, because I think there were forces in his life, God knows, I'm not qualified even to think of, to be the comment, but there were a lot of forces in his family. The most interesting man in that family. So the answer to your question is you're just wrong about what Nigel did. And you're probably wrong about what I did. I mean, you may not have looked at what I did. I find most people that ask me those questions haven't actually looked at what I did. Because if you do look at what I did, what I'm getting now is I'm getting every day a lot of calls from people that say, "Hey, boy, I think, the adverse publicity helps a lot, because if it's at all reasonably coherent, I can ride all week on it. My God, there's no comma faults." Anyway, no, there were a lot of stories. I'll give you a typical example. Organized crime, a lot of rumors about it. Did a lot of work on that. Found first-hand witnesses. In one case, Tina Sinatra, Frank Sinatra's daughter, who is in her 50s, runs a corporation for her father, a large corporation, makes, I think it's a $100 million a year business or more, and has a production company. Talked to her father. We started this years ago, and ended up talking to me at length. I'll absolutely concede quickly she's secondhand. She's talked to her father about what her father did to bridge the gap between the Kennedy family and organized crime, but I'll take secondhand sources like Tina Sinatra any day in the week. So I did make a conscientious effort to move some of the stories out of the myth into the reality a little bit, at least move them closer to being demonstrable. There's no videotape of Joe Kennedy meeting with Sam Giancana to cut a deal. I will tell you that Joe Kennedy is the most interesting Kennedy. As some of you might remember, I've said this a lot of times, he was in the Hollywood movie business in the late 30s, and he understood what we now call spin control 30 years ago. And the genius of Joe Kennedy is to take this beautiful child, this rather nondescript, lackluster boy who was in the Senate, wasn't sure why he was there, he knew Daddy wanted him to be there, and run him as a movie star and win it. He was the first guy to run somebody as a celebrity. So I just suggest, you're right and wrong about Nigel. Yes, sir.
How much of the dark side was due to the free ride he got from the press, and is there any reason to think that situation has changed?
How much of the dark side was due to the free ride Kennedy got from the press, and is there any reason to think it's been changed? It's changed enormously, I'd say, for the better. Nobody could be as critical as I am these days about the press, let me assure you. But having said that, you look at the difference between 60 and 80, 1960s and the 1980s. In the 1960s, whatever objection there was to the war in Vietnam was based simply on practical matters. We weren't really going to fight it right. And the idea of having to stop communism, because if we didn't stop it there, the Chinese were going to come, and et cetera, was just bought and sold by us, although there was a lot of scholarship available saying quite the contrary. And so the press really, in the early 60s, I think that the press's main complaint is the war should be fought more efficiently. By the 80s, Ronald Reagan could not sell a communist threat in Central America to us. He never could sell it. And the press was much more skeptical about the imminence of the threat in Nicaragua. And so that's a big improvement. I think also just in terms of how we look at presidents, after Watergate things changed. We idealized presidents until Watergate. I mean, we never would have thought the things we thought about. Well, Johnson, certainly, we began to cut into him pretty much too, a lot. And he quickly bailed out. But the bottom line is that I think with Bill Clinton, what you see is what you get. And we re-elected him knowing a great deal more than we need to know about his character. I don't know where the line is on private lives. As long as it doesn't, I don't care what anybody does as long as it doesn't impinge on their performance as president. And I don't care what Robert Kennedy did or Ted Kennedy did or others in that White House. I care what the president did in terms of its impact on his duties and his job. And I don't see any evidence that what Clinton does in his private life has any impact on his policies. And I also think we have much more informed consent. I'm one of those people that, you know, there was a great review after James Agee of The Nation. Agee, how do you, Agee? A-G-E-E, I never knew how to pronounce it. Hard G or soft G? Agee. When he reviewed a movie, he used to be a film critic for The Nation. He reviewed a movie in 1939 called Going My Way with Bing Crosby and Barry Fitzgerald, remember that? And his review had one sentence: after seeing this movie, I want to start a Be Kind to God Club. And so I, you know, like today, I would say I want to start a Be Kind to Janet Reno Club, you know. It seemed to me all she did was make a decision based on the merits. And all of a sudden she's being accused of being in some cabal. Sometimes we you know, we go too far. Yes?
Mary McRory, writing in the Post after the ABC special on Kennedy, concluded Kennedy was a bad husband but a good president. Would you comment?
Well, Mary McRory, you know, as she said, she and I are dear friends. She also had a wonderful line. She said, Jack Kennedy will outlive Cy Hersh, comma, not because he deserves to. You know, it's an amazing line. She really uses words like weapons, you know. And I think he was a bad president, ultimately. I think he left us with a bad war. I think he left us with to get back to his question about the press, I think it's very simple. Jack Kennedy's enduring love affair was not with women, but with men. Not only Robert McNamara, and not only Arthur Sylvester, and not only McGeorge Bundy, but the press corps. They did want very much to be with him. He was where the action was. Chuck Spaulding, his good friend, who now lives in California, said to me, when Jack Kennedy entered the room, he said, the temperature went up 150 degrees. He was not only just physically attractive, he had an immense presence. And you sort of knew the fun was where he was at. You know, you felt that. And everybody wanted to be with him. And I think the idea of doing what I'm doing, I mean, you know, look at the grief I'm getting 35 years, not later, you know, trying to get something. I just think it would have been impossible for a journalist to do something negative. It was such a myth. Yes, so go ahead. Your question was, I think bad president. I just think because Jack Kennedy, it seems to me, left us with one of the things that came out. Oliver Stone is one of the things that came out in his view of the world. And I'm really ambivalent about being compared to Oliver Stone. Somebody did in a review of the television documentary, and the guy who did it, Mark Oppenhaus, who's this wonderful filmmaker, was flattered. He said, hey, that's, you know, when he's good, he's really good. Anyway, and when he's crazy, he's really crazy. Anyway, his view is that Jack Kennedy would have ended the war. And let me tell you how I think about that. I found a lot of anecdotal evidence to support that theory. One of his good friends, Charles Bartlett, who's a wonderful man, and that Jack Kennedy had such a decent guy as a friend, says an awful lot. There are sides to Jack Kennedy that we can't begin to fathom. The word the Secret Service used is faceted, like a diamond. Compartmentalize is another word. This is a man who could go through a morning of Dave Powers brooding about getting rid of the girl that's there, and then brooding about some threat he had, and then go to a meeting and perform brilliantly. He just didn't seem to carry his troubles with him as he went on from meeting to meeting. And people talk about his wonderful performance in the missile crisis, the tapes that have come out, and he was on top of his game. Albeit I still have reservations about how he got there. But for that week he was brilliant, and whatever his other problems were. There's a wonderful McNamara story about, an off-the-record McNamara story about Jack Kennedy during the crisis. At one of those nights when they were having the decision was, Khrushchev had sent 2 letters, and were you going to respond? Everybody knows this history, as many do. They ended up, he made a private and a public recommendation, and one of them called for getting rid of the trading missiles that they didn't want to respond to publicly, so they responded to the first thing publicly and took the deal, anyway, whatever they were doing. In the middle of all this tense negotiation, McNamara, Bundy, Russ, the president, and Bobby, a courier comes in, a very beautiful young woman from the Pentagon, with a message for McNamara, who's been staying in the White House for days on end. And the president said to McNamara, he said, who's that? And he said, oh, it's somebody new. We're so busy. We're running so many messages. She's from the Commerce Department on loan. And Jack said, well, get her number, Bob. We may not go to war tonight. So he had this ability. You understand, he was able to laugh at himself. His own obsessions, he could look outside himself and laugh at himself about him and make fun of himself. in ways that none of the other guys would dare do. I mean, so he's just per se interesting. I mean, God, I would have swooned like anybody else. Anyway, on Vietnam, the issue for me is this. Charlie Bartlett said to me that at one point, and Charlie's memory is terrific. I've worked, he's just amazing. After all, this was the president. It's not hard to remember what a president says to you. He probably took good notes afterwards. Kennedy once said to him, they hate us. They want to throw us out of there, and I want to get out of there, but I can't do it before the election. He said, I just can't take the political heat. He said, but I got to get us out of there. It's just awful. And Bartlett, as he said to me, it was the first time, as much as he admired Jack Kennedy, it was the first time he ever really thought we should have one 6-year term, because the idea that he's going to do this. So I think Kenny O'Donnell writes about it, although needless to say I'm rather skeptical of anything I read in that book, but maybe he didn't have his pajamas on when he talked to him and wasn't kneeling by the bed and giving his prayers. But Kenny O'Donnell says that Jack said to him, I'm going to get out, and he's told the same thing to Mansfield. And he wanted to get out. He didn't think the war, like as I said earlier, like McNamara, he did not think we could win the war. And you have to understand, if Johnson hadn't done the madness Johnson did in Vietnam, taking 17,000 troops and building up to 550 and beginning the round-the-clock bombing and this insanity, we wouldn't think what Kennedy did was so mild. What Jack Kennedy did, he took 200 people and he built it up to 17,000, and he expanded the rules. He had military men flying in, in Mufti, combat operations. He put the CIA at work dramatically. He expanded covert operations in the North Vietnam, a lot of Navy SEALs, and he began a program called, I'll never forget the word, 4 Eyes and 4 Ears, was the precursor of what became the Phoenix program. A good friend of mine worked in it. They used to have the Ace of Spades, and they'd kill people, cut out their eyeball and leave the Ace of Spades, beginning in early 61, 62. It was part of a counter-terror. We called it counter-terror, just like we call nuclear hitting first, counter-force, from to target somebody first. Anyway, the point of all this is that, so Kennedy, at the same time he's letting the war go, and he doesn't want American troops there. He's been against it, although all of his advisors, playing to John F. Kennedy, as I told you, John Kennedy, they loved him so much they never gave him his best. They never gave him their best. Everybody was too eager to please to give him his best. It's like Arthur Schlesinger writing about, don't even sign the order, Mr. President, we must protect you. Oh, dear saint. Anyway, so what happens is, one thesis, I don't know what the reality is, I just know one possibility is Jack Kennedy was as much of a hawk as we think he was, or he sounded like, and he would have gone in there and did what Lyndon Johnson did, expanded the war. That's one possibility. I don't think so. But what happened is, and this is what's new in the book that really amazed me, it turned out in the summer and fall of '63, it was there for the getting, but none of us had ever gone that way. I'm not suggesting that this is the first time anybody's ever found this stuff. A lot of new stuff is coming out in since the collapse of communism in '89. Soviet files have been coming out with incredible regularity, and it's almost impossible for the press, which isn't doing a great job anyway, to keep up with it. There's the Woodrow Wilson Center here has a study of, a historical study bulletin that's been doing every year or so. They put out a huge volume of translated Soviet documents in various areas. That's just brilliant. That never gets picked up by the press. They're doing a lot on, one of the things that's come across is the sense that Ho Chi Minh in the summer of '63 and Diem, the non-communist president of Vietnam, began talks, secret talks, to end the war. As Ho Chi Minh said to a communist official, and it's found in one of the documents, he said, look, I don't like Diem, I've never liked him, they've been bitter political enemies for 25 years. He said, but he's a Vietnamese first, and I can live with him. Anything better than the Americans. It wasn't hard to see what we were going to do because we were doing it already. By '63, the destruction of that society was underway. The foliation, napalm. Let me give you the Kennedy argument. Fortified Hamlet, strategic Hamlet, Green Berets, counterinsurgency, it was all in place. It was all there by '61, '62, early '62. I sound like Noam Chomsky, but he's dead right on this. And anyway, I should say and instead of but. I sound like Noam Chomsky, and he's dead right on this. So what Kennedy does, Kennedy knows this. He's very concerned about this. And there's a lot of, and I'm not just quoting casually. In the book I quote Tom, the former head of the State Department Intelligence. I just got a letter from him today. Tom Hughes. Is it Tom Hughes? He was at the Carnegie Institute for years. Tom Hughes told me, I remember I had to track him down in Asia somewhere. He said, yes, we all knew it. We actually, some of us thought it was a great idea. What a way to end the war. Just let him kick us out. They were going to kick us out. They were going to get together with the North and South. We're going to begin. The plan was to begin trading postal exchanges, some currency exchanges, some mail exchanges, as I said, and also some rice exchanges, some food stuff, and then gradually broaden and develop a regular anyway, whether it was real, let me just go on. So John F. Kennedy did not want that in '63 because he did not want to do anything. He wanted to win with a huge plurality. He envisioned Goldwater. He saw a chance to get 60%. You've got to remember he won by 118,000 votes. That's less than 1 vote per precinct in America. There's more precincts than that. And he won by, you know, the narrowest margins in 100 years. And so Kennedy wanted a big plurality. He didn't want to take a chance. And so the way you say it, a way of looking at it, is ZM was offering Kennedy a solution that was good and useful, and he wanted, but he was offering it in the wrong time. So he had to die. So he had to be overthrown. And that's pretty amazing. I think we don't elect presidents to do that. And I just think, and I think the case is so clear, it's just another way of looking at something we haven't looked at. And he had to go because he wanted to do something, but in the wrong time period. Pretty amazing. It's very depressing. Not good president. Long answer to a short question.
I've got a short ethics and journalism question. You're quoted on the back of Paul Brodur's book, The Great Power Line Cover-Up, how the utilities and governments are trying to hide the cancer hazard posed by electromagnetic fields. And you're quoted as saying, this book should be required reading for every parent in America, especially those with children in grade school. P. Brodur is as good a journalist as it comes. Well, since then, the National Academy of Science, et cetera, et cetera. So did you make a mistake?
Oh, of course. But did I do something for somebody I worked with at the New Yorker? Yes.
That's journalism, isn't it? You do it for...
absolutely.
Your buddy comes to you, you know what's in the book, and you praise it.
Absolutely. I hope you noticed that you've never seen one of my books. I've never asked for a jacket comment ever. Never. But I absolutely... If somebody comes to me and says, you know, the image of me, of course, is the guy, when you open the door, I jump and grab you by your throat with my teeth. But the fact of the matter is, I just did one the other day for somebody. If I don't do it, I'm in real trouble. I have to do it for people. And I like Paul, by the way, this was written, that book was written before the National, oh no, was it that late?
That one was 95.
The one that I gave the comment on?
Yeah,
no.
95.
It would have been much earlier.
Pretty sure.
No.
I could be wrong, but I'll check it.
Anyway, it doesn't matter. The bottom line is, I guess I should say, that if you believe everything you read on a jacket comic, I've got a bridge I want to sell you.
But you being a Pulitzer Prize winner, and
believe me, I'm in agony
please don't
about
do
it.
that again. Please
No,
don't do that again.
I can't say I'm not going to do it again, because if a friend comes to me and it's a first book and he's trying to make a living, it's very tough.
But he cost this country $1 billion a year and scared people to death. And you really got to hold yourself back.
Well, usually I try and say, I don't try and get, you know, we can argue this forever, but you're right, and it's a bigger issue than just me. I hope you understand that. It's something, it's very much in the business.
Thank you very much for your answer.
Yeah, anyway, yes, ma'am.
So, are you singling Kennedy out with these different behaviors? I mean, I think about the Gulf War, and, you know, I think about all the other women and Iran-Contra. I mean, you know, are you really just singling him out?
I'm writing about him. I'm asked to write about him.
I have another follow-up question.
Oh, she asked if I was singling out Kennedy, you know, and then she thinks about the Gulf War, about which we really don't, the Gulf Syndrome, yeah, and Iran-Contra.
Trying to pick off Saddam Hussein, you know, I mean, we all know about that.
You know, we don't all know. She said something about trying to pick off Saddam Hussein. The fact of the matter is, there's no question we were headhunting for Saddam Hussein in violation of the rules promulgated by Richard Helms and the CIA. No, actually it was Schlesinger in the CIA, I think, James Schlesinger, promulgated after the stuff about assassination. And here we are, and we're not even making a big secret about it. Sort of a tee-hee, a collective tee-hee, and it's pretty awful that we target him. I think that bomb that went down the smoke pipe was aimed at him. They were doing headhunting.
The question still remains, are you singling him out?
You mean, is it worse? Is it generally across the board as bad as he?
Well, you know,
Well, you know, you know, God, there's a flip answer to that. As I'm writing a book about the guy, and I did not think I'd find what I found. I did not start to do that. I did not think I'd find that. I told you, the premise was there reason to think that something more might have happened in the end to him. And in the end, I end up thinking, I think this guy, Tom Powers in the New York Times had such guts, because he said what I didn't have the guts to say, which is that if I'm right about what I say about what Kennedy wanted to do to these other foreign leaders, there was a rough justice in his death. And in the end, I ended up thinking that, you know, they're going to have to change some of these goddamn highways and rename them back from off, you know, and that's an exaggeration, but you know what I'm saying. I didn't think That's a total hyperbole, folks. But the point I'm making is that I'm not advocating. The point I'm making is that I didn't think I'd find what I found. What am I supposed to do then? You know?
Do another one about somebody else and
No,
make
I
it
don't-
just bad.
I will tell you something. I am looking at the Gulf War, not in terms of the Gulf War syndrome, because I don't think that's the way to go with it, because that's an epidemiology argument. I'm looking at it in terms of, if I'm the president of the United States of the military fighting force, and I had a Gulf War, I'll give you my thought. Here's how I'm looking at it, just beginning to read into it. I had a war that ended up like this did, which very few combat deaths, but maybe a couple 100,000 combat fatalities that nobody wants to really deal with. The reason I don't want to talk about what happened, the reason I don't want to say how much I knew about conditions there before I sent him there, because we knew a great deal about what that battlefield was like, a lot of chemical weapons used there, and a lot of stuff we knew much more about. And I dare say that they had every reason to think that they made a good guess they could protect the soldiers, and they were wrong. And that's what they're afraid of talking about. Because if they tell the American people that we weren't able to protect your boys when they went to the Gulf War, they can't get them to another Gulf War. And more importantly, if you're a military planner, you can't get them to Korea. Because Japan's downwind of Korea, the Japanese will go nuts if we start this again. The Japanese worry about uranium depletion weapons. You know, we were using weapons of uranium depleted weapons, which go through armor and also then cause radioactive damage. I mean, you know, they get into the bones, whatever the word is, they attack the bones with radium, and we use those weapons. So I would guess that the story is less to do with what they could anticipate medically, but the sort of geopolitical concern. The reason they can't say to the American people, well, we thought we could protect them. We really knew we couldn't, but we sent them there anyway, not sure. And we can't talk about it because we want to be able to send them there again. I don't mean that. It's not diabolical. It's much more innocent, really. That's what happens. Yes, somebody else back there. Yes, sir.
You know, I have not read your book, but...
Well, then you're certainly qualified to talk about it, because that's, I can tell you right now, that seems to be the...
What strikes me, and it's building upon with the question that this woman just asked, is I don't see what's different, what John Kennedy did, than any other president has done, to a question of degree. And my question is sort of, is it a problem with the institution of the presidency, or is it the man? I mean, you look at Roosevelt. Roosevelt did the same thing in many ways that Kennedy did.
Well, the point I'm making is that the characterization of my book that you get often isn't the one I wish. So, having said that, but I think the one thing you have to deal with Kennedy is, I think the thing about Kennedy that's so striking is the difference between the perception of what he was doing and what he was doing. We have a much greater, you know, this is the original Teflon guy, you know, I mean, you know. Well, but you're operating not with some information, you see, and that's the...
Shut up. When I talk about reading a book like No Ordinary Time about Roosevelt, I was not part of that era, but when I talked to my father who fought in the war and World War II, his impression of Roosevelt is much the same as my impression is or was of Kennedy. And I think that people sort of in a time, especially during World War II, they look to Roosevelt much the same way. He had the same Teflon, or we wouldn't have gotten World War II.
Well, you know, FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, understood something that Joseph Kennedy did not, and that is that there was a moral issue at stake in stopping Nazi Germany. Joe Kennedy never understood that. Never understood that. FDR did. And then whatever you say about FDR, he understood there was a much, whatever, and you're absolutely right, FDR and Hoover, et cetera, in his personal life. But the point I make about Kennedy and his personal life, that's what you're talking about, is that it's but an indicator of other things. It's but it's just a signpost. It's an easy one for people to absorb and understand, and certainly exciting for the public. You know, people will read the book because of that. I'm not unaware of that. But basically, there was, you know, FDR saw something. There was something very special in FDR. I'm sorry for all of that, and I don't see it in John F. Kennedy. I just don't see it. And I think the gap between the perception, but again, you know, let me go back there. Yes, sir.
Yes, this is a question about journalistic methods, and it touches on the issue of ethics. Here you have a gold mine of 4 Secret Service agents, former Secret Service agents, who are providing you with a vast amount of information. How do you corroborate what they're telling you?
Well, first of all, it's not 1, it's not 2, it's not 3, it's 4. And then for those 4, you can only begin exponentially to imagine how many people told me A, to go to hell, or B, talk to me off the record, not going near being named. I mean, you know, there was an awful lot of secrets. I will tell you, I obviously talked to many more than 4. Plus, there were other Secret Service agents quoted. If in the book, there's a guy named Bouck, B-O-U-C-K, who's a Secret Service agent who I quote only about installing wiretaps.
But how did their stories overlap?
Oh, well.
One another?
It's one of the things I do for a living, which is you take a person and you ask him details, and you then go and he tells you about trips that were made and people were on it, and you find people, you find the trips, you talk to people, and if you don't think I was able to talk to some people who were not in the Secret Service about some of this stuff, I was. Most notably, some of the women involved. Obviously, I didn't without getting into who they are or where they are. I didn't write it. But I obviously went to some of the women involved and talked to them at the time about some of these things. They knew the names. Some of the names are pretty staggering I talked to, and obviously I didn't write about it. So that's one way. And also in the community they were in. So, the bottom line is, and also don't forget, the 4 of them also not only were named, but they took the unusual step of going on television. And that's, let me tell you about television. It's interesting. I didn't know that much about television. I'd been on television, but I never worked in an operation before. And in television, we had a guy named, a guy that was a one-time World War II hero that became a mob lawyer. Was a state's attorney named Bob McDonnell, who was really a shifty guy, and he'd been a mob lawyer. And he went on camera after 2 years of sweet talking. He finally went on camera with his story about arranging a meeting between a judge and Joe Kennedy, and using a judge's chambers for a meeting between Joe Kennedy and Sam Giancana. And the story had some resonance, some provenance, even if you will, because we knew from Tina Sinatra that they had already begun a talk. They already had some intermediaries going. So why not me? It's sort of the next step. And if I'm interviewing for the New York Times, I can quote him all week, so-and-so alleged, and then I quote his negative stuff, and I can do that. For network television, I had to give the lawyers and the editors at ABC, the senior executives, I had to give them, I did about a week's worth of interviews on this guy, some of which a little bit of it trickled into the book, to demonstrate that there was a very strong reason for believing him, because somebody on television is per se taken to be telling the truth by the American public. There's no caveat. You can't use the word alleged or claimed like we do in the, it's our sign, and when we write somebody claimed, it's a tip-off that we may not even believe ourselves. So it's interesting. So how you do it? You just do it by digging and digging and digging. And I am here to tell you that what they said happened, unfortunately. I wish I could tell you otherwise. Yes, sir, way in the back. I'll do both. Go ahead.
Did you read Richard Bissell's interview in the Kennedy Library, and what did you think of it? And secondly, did you read a book called The Search for JFK?
Yes, by Blair. I read, Richard Bissell did an interview. The question was, did I read an interview by Richard Bissell, the former head of operations in the CIA, did the Bay of Pigs? Did I read his book? Did I read his interview in the Kennedy Library? And the second question was, did I read A Search for JFK by Mr. and Mrs. Blair? Right, Clay Blair, and what was her name? Anyway, yeah, I read it. It was the first book written in the middle 70s, the first book beginning to debunk the Kennedys, raising a lot of questions about a lot of things, and a marvelous book that for some reason, although it got into the mainstream, wasn't a great bestseller. And the Bissell oral history I did read, Bissell gave an oral history to the Kennedy Library, was fascinating, because among other things, it contradicted so many other things he said. Richard Bissell was, here. There was, and now I sound like I'm talking phantasmagoric, there was a secret world in the United States in 52 and 54 and 56 and 58. The CIA were much more powerful than you can imagine. I allege in this book that it was very possible the CIA had incredibly damaging information on Richard Nixon in 1952. They knew he'd taken money from a Romanian exile who had worked with the Nazis and the communists after the fall of Romania and at the end of World War II. And communists took control. And Beadle Smith, the head of the CIA, was Eisenhower's aide-de-camp in World War II, and he refused to let the information out on grounds he didn't want to upset the election for Eisenhower. A lot of power. And the agency made a collective decision sometime in the 59-60 that they were going to support John F. Kennedy for president. And they did a lot of things. I write about this. They did a lot of things to help John F. Kennedy become president, and Bissell was part of it. Richard Bissell was part of a group that wanted Kennedy to win, and I argue in this book, did quite a bit, basically betrayed what was going on inside the Nixon camp as much as he could to Kennedy. And it's a long story, but it's a good question because he's getting into arcane stuff, and it's sort of a secret, dirty, little lousy history that nobody wants to talk about. But the CIA did help elect John F. Kennedy. They saw him as being more in tune with their values than Richard Nixon, which is interesting. Be kind, the Richard Nixon Club here. Yes?
It's almost a certainty now that the Cusack papers are forged, and you were duped in that. How does this affect the credibility of your book?
Well, tell me, are they in the book?
Well,
you know, I've been here. Let me just say this about those papers, these are. He's asked me about the famous Monroe papers in which he alleged that Marilyn Monroe alleged that John F. Kennedy blackmailed her, and there was an exchange of documents in which Kennedy allegedly set up a trust fund that I certainly did believe, and that turned out to be false. And I just say this because I've been in the hot seat before with stories. You know, the My Lai massacre story, nobody believed, and when they did, every GI who had 3 beers in the enlisted men's club would call me up at home and tell me what he was going to do to my private parts. This went on for a long time, all these crazy stuff. And in the CIA, when I did the CIA stuff, I had Helms, actually, among others, a 3-month campaign, mostly in the Washington Post and elsewhere, other papers, against my reporting in the New York Times. And so I've been criticized wildly. But this is the first time in this case I was criticized for what I didn't write and what I thought. I thought they were good. I did a year's work on them. Obviously, I was doing many other things. And obviously, if you think about what I knew when I got them, in view of what I knew about from the Secret Service, I had a lot more reason to believe it than the average person could know. And I couldn't talk about it till the book came out. My lips were sealed. And we determined a year ago, and I shouldn't say a year ago, it was we began looking at it a year ago, and about 4 months afterwards, in the spring, we pretty sure we were in trouble with the papers. This is working with ABC. We spent a fortune on forensic. We ended up, since they were handwritten, there were 300 to 400 or 500 handwritten documents in Kennedy's hand. And a lot of people think some of those may be good. They're so witty, they're so bright, and you can't dispel them because all the tests are inconclusive. But there's some typed documents we eventually found were typed, we believe, on typewriters that weren't available then. And anyway, so went public with it. I didn't feel like going to the FBI about it. That wasn't what I do. I couldn't write it because I was working for ABC, so we put it out on ABC in the fall. U.S. Attorney began a grand jury, and I, for the life of me, I don't feel anything but sort of proud. I feel it supports what I do. The fact that I found something, it wasn't good, it was certainly sensational. But I'll tell you right now, I and Peter Jennings both had never, if you'd asked us both, we both got a lot of criticism for it. I certainly more than Peter, but he got some too, because he was the front man for the story, the anchor for the story. We never anticipated we thought everybody would care about the forgery, which was quite brilliant, rather than our involvement. The fact is, as I said, it's not in the book, and I don't think it does anything to diminish it. The day I don't believe documents and I don't jump on them and get excited is the day I want to quit journalism. I got excited. I thought they were great. I went after them. They weren't. End of story. I don't know what else I could do. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any criticism that you see that's been written or said recently about your book that you see as valid, or that...
Is there any criticism that I see as valid? Yeah, of course.
But is there, what part of the book do you think...
Is this your beating your wife question? Let me think about this.
You point to...
Is there any criticism that drives me into a fetal position? Is that what you're saying? I'm just trying to rephrase the question. Is there any criticism that I write in the back of my hand and then don't wash my hands?
Talk, you said critics have said wildly. Is there any one critic that you would agree with saying,
let me tell you, the obvious criticism that's very valid and that makes a lot of sense is this is not a rounded picture of John F. Kennedy. And the way I combat it is I say, and the best I can do, I say, look, folks, the title of the book is not a well-balanced, rounded, complete compendium or history of John F. Kennedy's presidency. It's the dark side. That's what I say, and I make little jokes about maybe I should have put it in plain wrapper paper, you know. But the bottom line is, if I I had a wonderful editor. He's the managing editor of the Atlantic Monthly, who I've worked with for 15 years, and I just insisted he edit it because he's not afraid to tell me to go to hell, and you're full of junk. And he's a great editor, and Corby Cummer of Boston, and he wrote me a note at some point that's on my wall, and it has 3 things. What's new? What does this tell us about Robert F. Kennedy and what does this tell us about Robert F. Kennedy and John F. Kennedy? And then 3, what does it tell us about the 2 of them, their relationship too? Some question like that. I'm not quite sure I'm getting it right. And the problem I had is I decided just to stick to what's new because so much has been written. And so that's a very narrow focus. And I guess in a perfect world, I would have made the book much bigger. And it would have been, I can't second guess myself on it. I don't think, and there's nothing, somebody asked me, one interviewer asked me, what did you give up to the lawyers? You know, the libel lawyer, the chief lawyer for Little Brown or for Time Warner came, naturally. And we did it in a day and a half. I didn't lose one thing. You know, there's a story in there, let me just tell you where I quote a guy named Oscar Wyatt. Oscar Wyatt's president of Coastal Oil, chairman of the board, one of the large oil companies. Oscar Wyatt's the guy you might remember that flew into Baghdad. He's this, you know, this irascible oil magnate. You know, he runs this large company. He's a larger-than-life guy who told me the following story one day. I used to talk to him about Texas and Bush and oil a lot because he was a big oil. And he goes back to Joe Kennedy. He was working the oil fields of Joe Kennedy in Corpus Christi. Told me a story about after the Bay of Pigs. One thing that happened at the Bay of Pigs is, my theory in the Bay of Pigs is real simple. You know, one of the great mysteries, enduring mysteries, is why did Jack Kennedy not stop the bombing and sort of back off? And I can speculate. Jack Kennedy came into the office bringing in the mob with him and the CIA. And in the book I say, I have the Secret Service logs of meetings that aren't publicly available. Richard Bissell saw John F. Kennedy 13 times off the record between January 20, 1961, Inauguration Day, and April 15th. Now, the meetings sometimes lasted for many hours. I have a hunch they might have had something to do with the Bay of Pigs. I just have a thought. But, you know, although John F. Kennedy will tell you, and the historians will tell you that he was saddled with the Eisenhower program. And Eisenhower did it, he just followed through. The fact is, Kennedy's stamp was all over it. And it was his program. He made it much bigger, changed the attack date. And one of the side things that Bissell now talks about, he talked about before he died a couple of times only. He was very fuzzy about it, but I now have it from other people firsthand in the book. They brought mafia in. They brought Sam Giancana in. After all, Sam Giancana, the killer from Chicago, had won the election for him, so he thought, and he gave him another assignment, kill Castro before the election. Why would Sam do it? Because as long as Castro's there, the mob doesn't have gambling in Havana. And the gambling and the hotels and the prostitution was all a great source of revenue. People keep on saying to me, oh, how can you possibly correlate this enormous conundrum? Bobby continued to prosecute organized crime. And how could he do that? And how could they have cut a deal? It's sort of contradictory. Not at all. I'll tell you why. As long as Jack Kennedy's in office, he wanted to kill Castro. As long as he wanted to kill Castro, they were going to get back, maybe. If Castro's killed, the new government's put in, the mob's going to get back to gambling. The real money they were making in the 50s. Gambling, prostitution, that's all very real stuff. And it's sort of a compelling story. It's a long way to go about a source. Oscar Wyatt told me an amazing story. Kennedy then thought the mob would kill Castro. That was the assignment before the invasion. And as I said, he thought they could do everything. They failed. And so you have to look, my argument, I say in the book, I can't tell you the answer, but you have to look at Kennedy's subsequent retreat from the operation, refusal to commit more air support, say I'm not going to help. You have to look at it from the prism of knowing that an assassination is not going to take place. Not only Fidel, but his brother Che Guevara and his brother Raul. They all 3 were supposed to be ripped off by the mob, murdered. And anyway, and I didn't write this because the guy who told me this, there's a wonderful CIA guy named Jake Esterlin. Jake worked behind the lines in Burma in World War II. He was the most idealistic of the CIA. Sort of the guy who really was in there to stop communism, saw it as a great threat. Jake's working in Cuba. He's the chief of staff for Bissell in Havana. And he told me, he didn't remember it, so I didn't use this in the book. He said that 2 days before the invasion, he got a call from, he thought it was Bobby Kennedy, but he wasn't sure. Jake was foggy. So I didn't use the story, but here's the story he tells. He thought it was Bobby. Certainly somebody from the White House called up and said, what happens if we cancel this? Because once the mob can hit, once the mob doesn't kill Castro, Kennedy has to know his invasion's in real trouble. 1,400 men against Castro's military, which is all beefed up anyway, anticipating some invasion. And Jake said, well, Jake's very smart. Jake said, well, I told this guy from Washington. He says, well, they won't take Havana, but they're sure as hell going to take Miami. They're going to come back and really be mad. And you had to get rid of that. And so out of this emerges, Kennedy shuts down the operation. 4 pilots from Alabama fly in by themselves and get killed. The Alabama Air National Guard was training the Cubans in Guatemala, in Nicaragua rather. And they took off by themselves without orders, the bomb and strafe. They were so angry at the Kennedys' refusal to permit more bombing raids, knowing it was consigning the guys to death. Some died, most were captured. And they were shot down and killed. And there was panic in the White House that they had gone, and panic in the White House that one of them would survive, because if you remember Gary Francis Powers, the U-2 pilot, Fidel Castro pulled him out by his ears at a May Day parade, and there was panic that Castro would, in a celebration, would bring out a couple of pilots and wave them around, blowing the cover, embarrassing Jack Kennedy. So what happened is Bissell went over one night on the 18th or 19th and walked in, and Bobby Kennedy puts his finger in Bissell's face and says, those goddamn pilots had better be dead. It's an amazing story. And the families of the pilots are told, you're getting nothing. No pensions, no anything. And they're very upset. Their husbands are dead. There's wives and children. All 4 of them had wives and children. Yeah, all 4 did. And they're told no pension, no anything. We can't give you anything. The government was in a panic. We're not going to admit anything about you guys. Forget it. And one of them went to Oscar Wilde. One of them was a relative of Oscar Wilde or knew somebody. There was a connection to Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde had raised a ton of money for the Johnson Kennedy ticket. And Wyatt flies into Washington and sees the boys, because he has the right to. He raised millions for them, and he goes in, and here's the story he told me, very much off the record. I walked in there and I said to them, you better give him the money. You better put him on pension. And they said, hell no, Jack and Bobby. He said, Bobby did all the talking, but he knew Jack. It was for Jack, representing Jack. And he said, I'm going to go to the newspapers, the Washington Post and the New York Times, if you don't do it, if you don't give these people pension. And then Jack said, Oscar will take care of them. And they did. They set up a lawyer. I write all about that. And of course, I had the story, he wouldn't go on the record. And when the lawyer came, she said, we can't use it. So I went to Oscar. And Oscar said, are you out of your mind? But he did it. He did it. I faxed him some of the pages around it, the rest of the stuff. And he said, okay. And not only that, he made it better. He made it more accurate, which most people do. I have found that if you give people things to read in advance, newspaper men rarely do it. They make it better. People don't lie about it. They don't fudge it. So there, I wouldn't change any of that. I would do what I said I would do, which, you know, in a perfect world, I would have written a book twice as big, and it would have been much better, I think, in the long run. But it wouldn't have been, it would have been 17,000 pages. I once wrote one that long. $50 says the bookseller. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious if you have any opinion or speculation on what it says about the American public or the American press, that there's so much unwillingness to believe in the things that you and some other writers are writing about Kennedy.
The question is, yeah, we've got to end in a few minutes. You're the boss on that, Carla. You want me to end it on this question? Let me end it on this question so you can all go home. Why is there so much unwillingness of the press and others to
They don't only believe in the hagiographies. It seems.
Well,
why are they so unwilling?
yeah, why would you want to, I really don't, I make fun of that book by Kenny O'Donnell, and there is some method to the making fun. I don't know, forget me for a second, but just suppose some of the things, if a few of the things I write, just a few of them I write, let's just say that, then so much of what the journalists and the historians have told us about that presidency is wrong. And so that's hard to contemplate. You know, we didn't get into it, but I recommend all of you really think long and hard about why we got into the missile crisis and what happened. I know people find it, even a lot of my peers who like me and like my work find it hard to accept. And I will tell you right now, there's a lot of wonderful new scholarship making the same. I'm not even that bold or daring in what I'm saying about Kennedy and the missile crisis. A lot of PhD theses, I read a lot of those, are making the same points now. Political scientists are beginning to turn around slowly but surely. And the political scientists have been very skeptical of this presidency for a long time. But I also dare say, if you went out into the street, public opinion polls show it all the time, among the people, he still gets a higher rating than Abe Lincoln. Which is just, that's an example. One last question.
She's already
all right.
said it.
All right, follow.
I want to know.
Okay.
and it's...
I like the aggression. You gotta reward aggression. Go ahead.
Thank you.
You
What's
would
your
say that.
personal theory about who killed both brothers? I mean,
My personal
I
theory?
haven't read the book, but after listening to the Peter Jennings show, I mean, it's like there's an obvious answer to me, but I don't want to state the obvious. I mean, the same killed both.
I think you have to get back. No, I have nothing new to add to it. Absolutely nothing new. I don't think organized crime killed him because why kill the goose that's going to lay the golden egg? As long as he's there, they have a chance of killing Castro. Johnson cared so little about it. Eventually, he didn't have the obsession. And the same with this is the question about who killed Kennedys, by the way, for C-SPAN. So I have nothing new about it. I think it's a tar baby. I think the real answer is. The real answer, you know, it's funny, I'll tell you, I didn't write a word of it, but Marion Schlesinger, Arthur Schlesinger's wife, gave a brilliant oral history to the Kennedy Library they classified, which of course made me run like crazy to get it. And when you finally did get it, she finally gave it to me. It was all about the atmosphere of violence in that White House. It was what she, as I say, I didn't write it because it wasn't relevant to what I was doing. She was, ethereally, she was writing about what she said, you couldn't put your fingers on it, but there was a sense of out of control. And she then described all the people who committed suicide, who were killed in violent deaths out of the White House. There was an enormous, it was a keening place. They were in a keening high pitch. And so I don't know. I don't have an answer. I don't think organized crime could have done it. I don't think Castro had any reason to do it. He was, you know, he's too, I just think the evidence is slim. I think maybe he died as stupidly and inconsequentially. But, you know, in a funny way, it may be that his death wasn't as...
Live at 8 p.m. tonight. Next, a look at the personal life of President John F. Kennedy from investigative reporter Seymour Hersh. He talks about his recent book, The Dark Side of Camelot, and takes audience questions. It's about an hour and 10 minutes.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Carla Cohen. I'm one of the owners of Politics and Prose, and I want to welcome you here tonight to hear my good friend Seymour Hersh. Cy has been a great supporter of Politics and Prose over the years, and it's always a pleasure when a book of his comes out. There's a fair amount of publicity often, and people are interested. And we can say that that's true this time as well. There's my partner, Barbara Mead, standing in the back. And so on behalf of both of us, I want to thank Cy for for everything he's done for us over the years, and to say how glad I am that he's here tonight with us.
Thank you. You know, if Carla asked me to come, I come. And I come, period. I don't worry about it. I'm just here, happy to be here. Great bookstore. I thought I'd just start by giving you a little bedtime reading. Literally from, it's something you have to deal with. You know, it's something I'm dealing with all the time, because this perception, this sort of, he just didn't have to do it. This is a book that has another interesting facet to it. It's not terribly long, but it's pretty long. It's, what, 400 some odd pages in paperback, 500 pages in paperback, and it's about the presidency, mostly. And in the index, there's only one Hoover, and it's Herbert Hoover. There's no J. Edgar Hoover in the index. The only other book I know like that is a book called Kennedy by Theodore Sorensen, which is 800 pages long, which also has only Herbert Hoover in the index. I don't know what to make of that, but let me read you another document, just another sort of thing when I'm beginning to look at this book, thing I'm thinking about. I'm reading these books. This is not a book. This is a document written by Arthur Schlesinger, the historian, whose books on Jackson and FDR, he did a 3-volume series I remember reading with great passion a long time ago when I was a kid, after I was out of school, when, of course, everybody starts reading. And April the 10th, 61, it's 6 days before the Bay of Pigs invasion. It's a memo to the president. The political, diplomatic, and economic problems we're facing. Some of you might remember your history. Bay of Pigs was the great defeat for the Kennedy administration. And he's giving some advice on how the Russians will exploit the situation. And this is how he's talking to his president. He said the first communist effort will be to nail down the already existing impression that such a landing is sponsored. The landing of Cuban exiles on Cuba at the Bay of Pigs is sponsored to combat the existing impression that such a landing is sponsored by the U.S. A memoir called Johnny, We Hardly Know You, written by Kenny O'Donnell and David Powers, published in 1976, great bestseller. It was described as a warm, intimate portrait of JFK by the men who knew him best. And here's my favorite section. He's describing, Dave Powers, who was the president's closest friend, is describing a typical quiet meeting at home with the president. And it says, I'll read you a graph or so. Dave was accustomed to being summoned for night duty at the White House when Jackie was absent. He called himself John's other wife. The president hated to be alone in the evening. It was understood that Dave would be available to keep him company, etc., etc. Dave stayed with him till he went to bed. The nightly routine was always the same. The White House kitchen staff would prepare dinner, broiled chicken or lamb chops, left in a second-floor apartment. It was called the mansion by the Secret Service, the main upstairs living quarter. Literally, apartment's a good word for it. A nice apartment. On a hot plate appliance so they could eat it late in the evening without keeping any of the staff waiting to serve them. Then they would watch television or sit outside on the Truman balcony, or the president would read a book or smoke a cigar while Dave drank several bottles of Heineken's beer. They'd joke a little bit. Around 11 o'clock, the president would get undressed, slipped into the short-length Brooks Brothers sleeping jacket that he wore in preference to pajamas. Dave would watch him kneel beside his bed and say his prayers. Then he would get in the bed and say to David, I'm not kidding. Then he would get in bed and say to David, good night, pal, will you please put out the light? Dave would put out the light, leave the apartment, say good night to the Secret Service agent on duty in the downstairs hall, and drive home to his own home in McLean. Sort of like, I guess you could call it the Norman Rockwell version of life in the White House. But it is a history that was totally a huge bestseller, totally accepted. And so, for 25 years. Not only do we lie, but boss, don't get near signing anything or executing anything. It's called plausible denial. So I know about this document when I start. I read the Johnny, We Hardly Knew You, and I'll just tell you briefly the genesis of this book, which is so mundane as to be sort of staggering. I have an editor. His name is Jim Silberman. He used to be publisher of Random House. He's now at Little Brown. He's the one who encouraged me, more than 20 years ago, to start working on Kissinger. And about 10 years ago, he began whispering, Kennedy, Kennedy, Kennedy. He's a wonderful man. I'm always proud of the fact that he edited Philip Roth, who to me is like manna. Anyway, and so I, of course, resisted, I'm sure in part because it was his idea. And eventually I started reading, got into it, and sort of the heuristic approach, if that's the right word, probably isn't. The idea was, let's not worry about how he died, that is the assassination. Let's look at how he lived and see what that might tell us about how he would die. And I had something going in. I was a reporter at the New York Times, and in fact, many of you might remember, did a lot of work on the CIA and wrote a lot of the stories that, more or less, I'm not overdoing it or underdoing it, but led to the setting up of the Church hearing, the Senate Intelligence Committee. It was provoked by a series of articles I wrote in the Times, New York Times. And so I knew that hearing very well, and I watched it. I moved away from Washington, so I was watching it, just reading it. And what we had was this. We had the Senate Intelligence Committee doing a good job uncovering this awful business of assassinating Castro and other assassinations, Trujillo. No matter how ostensibly Cuban the operation is in fact is in personnel and equipment, most of the world, our friends as well as foes, will assume that it is American in its conception. He's talking to a president, and they both know of something, of course, which is that it's totally American in its conception. The CIA is operating it, doing it. It's not that the Cubans don't want to go, but it wouldn't happen without our involvement. So he's talking in sort of, I don't know, I don't know how to describe that language. But he goes on, and he's talking about how the Russians might exploit it. And he goes on to say, it's a long memo, 10 pages. He said maybe we should do a diversionary measure that might offset Soviet propaganda after the operation? Can we not affirm in some striking way our support for progressive governments in Latin America, like Venezuela? Can we not do something in Africa or Asia that will counteract the Soviet claim that we are unregenerate imperialists? Could something be brought before the United Nations in the next 10 days which permit us to take a strong anti-imperialist position as we go on invading the country? Then he says the following, point 10, protection of the president. The character and repute of President Kennedy constitute one of our greatest national resources. Nothing should be done to jeopardize this invaluable asset. When lies must be told, they should be told by subordinate officials. The next sentence is underlined. At no point should the president be asked to lend himself to the cover operation, that is the flimsy cover that is an indigenous Cuban operation without any outside help. For this reason, writes Schlesinger, there seems to be merit in Secretary Rust's suggestion that someone other than the president make the final decision and do so in his absence. That is the final decision to invade, and do so in his absence dash someone whose head can later be placed in the block if things go terribly wrong. Well, you really hear it so cleanly. And you really do hear it so cleanly, you know, even in a document that wasn't declassified.